Welcome to the Family Skeptical, Parenting Through Nonbelief.
We're a married atheist couple raising two wonderful, strange children. We ask big questions, dissect weird parenting moments, and examine how society ignores or misrepresents families like ours. If you're any stripe of nonbeliever involved in raising children, welcome. You are our people.
Our kids have heard all our swears, but yours might not have. So be thoughtful if there are young people listening with you.
Welcome back, moms.
I know. We were trying to decide what to talk about for this segment, and I almost feel like too much has happened since we last recorded.
Reader has had a spate of medical issues.
Yeah, since we last recorded, there was like a very tense drive to the emergency room, though everything ended up being fine. But there was that.
Yeah.
There were other injuries. We went and visited my family, did 2 9+ hour drives. It's just been a time. It's felt like a lot of parenting. Like it's always a lot of parenting, but it's like really been a lot of parenting.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think so. It's multiple things. So I feel like I am more exhausted than I've been since the kids were like really little and not sleeping through the night, because I just, I'm like an old lady now and time changes destroy me. So we went 1 hour earlier and I immediately started going to bed at like the normal time there, but then waking up an hour earlier at our normal time. And also, I don't know, just everything. So I think I'm just like very aware of the energy that it has taken in these sort of more intensive parenting moments. If that makes any sense.
No, that makes sense.
But it was also like an amazing time.
Yeah.
And I truly feel like kind of something magical happened each day of the trip. And it's really fun seeing the kids in just different situations where you get to learn more about them. Part of the trip we spent at a lake where my mom spent a lot of time when she was growing up. And on our final day there, the kids got to go tubing with one of my cousins and another family member. And it was so interesting because, Reader tends to be pretty brave in those situations, but it's also but not 100% consistently. So there's always the chance he could feel a little bit different. And then Go tends to be much more cautious in those. So I was the one who went out on the boat with them. And I was pretty sure Go was going to spend the entire time just in the boat with me. But Reader, he got out there and I was like, I think he's going to totally love this, but you just never know. But the second the boat went going, like they teach them hand signals, like go faster, go slower, those kind of things. And he had his thumb raised the entire time. Like if that boat could have gone any faster safely, I think that's what he would have been happy with. So I was like, okay, this is going to be like one of those brave moments. But then Go was watching and my cousin offered to take him out with her and he said yes. And so he ended up going with her. And by the end, it was getting close to when we had to go back in. And he decided that he wanted to go out on his own to get towed back into the dock. And I think actually would have been happy, like doing an actual ride on his own. So it was just so fascinating to see him make that decision with no pressuring, totally on his own.
Yeah, it was one of the most magical things. Like this is a kid who for the longest time wouldn't even go down a slide.
No, he still won't consistently.
And the thought of him, like, it still boggles the mind. The thought of him behind that boat, like, and I was there seeing him come in, and I was like, I really had to do a quadruple take because that was him being trailed behind the boat. I just, not something that you would have ever expected. So kids surprise us. I think what it comes down to is we have to give them the opportunity to surprise us. And the more we give them those opportunities, this comes down to something we talked about a couple of episodes ago too, and it'll be obvious in a second, but the more we give them those opportunities to surprise us, the more we engender trust, the more that we show them that we trust them like that to make those big decisions, the more that agency is going to affect every aspect of their lives. I think I'm going to say that without looking at any sort of studies, behavioral analyses, any statistical data, but I'm just going to say that feels right. That giving them that latitude to make mistakes or impress or both is fundamental to building that trust and bond between parent and child, and
I think I did a good job not acting at all surprised.
Oh, nice.
I tried really hard to just be like, yeah, this is totally normal.
Great. No, that's hard as a parent sometimes because when a child defies your expectations based on all logic, it is easy to in the moment where they decided to go left instead of always going right,
to walk that fine line of
you don't want your surprise to make them feel self-conscious.
Safe. Yeah. You are totally safe if you don't want to do this thing, but it is also like totally fine if you do. No expectations, just happy for wherever you want to go.
Yeah. Like you said, I guess I understand now. There has been a lot of parenting the last couple of weeks.
Yeah.
A lot of parenting.
Really, really intensely.
Big and small, but like lots of, we're doing this instead of that. Oh, we have to now manage that and this at the same time. It's been a lot of juggling. So looking forward to next week and the week after leading up to our next family trip being much more tranquil.
Yeah. Another callback. Knock on wood.
Oh, God. I feel like Roy Kent now, just groaning and grunting.
But speaking of parenting, one of the topics I wanted to discuss, I actually don't think I told you this when I brought it up, but I started thinking about it because of a parenting book I'm reading. So it's called Bless This Mess. And it's by Reverend Molly Baskett and Ellen O'Donnell, PhD. And I picked it up because I've just been interested in reading different kinds of Christian parenting advice.
Yeah.
And this is one of the few things that came up under progressive Christian parenting.
Mm-hmm.
And so I picked it up, and I don't know how much we're going to talk about it. Most of the advice isn't really Christian based. It's pretty kind of straight down the line parenting advice. A lot of stuff I've seen other places, make a family motto, share your values.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's been a little underwhelming.
Use a chore chart with stars.
Kind of. I don't know.
Put it on the refrigerator.
Yeah, kind of. So, but there's actually...
Not that that's bad.
No,
Shout out to chore charts.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's all fine. But actually the beginning made me quite upset. And I think I have to do some unpacking why bad advice from people who I feel like are more on my side makes me more upset sometimes than bad advice from people who are clearly sort of not aligned with me.
Okay.
But there was a section in the beginning, and they were talking about different parenting styles. And they were talking about Christian and other people of faith parenting in kind of more of a dictatorship style. Mm-hmm. And Then they said, meanwhile, the children raised in secular families were being taught to live by the principle of empathetic reciprocity. In other words, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, the golden rule, made famous by Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount. The secular parents may not have been raising their kids with religion, but they were raising them spiritually. And
what does that word mean?
It just made me so
What's a spiritual
mad.
mean?
It made me so mad because...
Why?
Because I think...
And not just disappointed? Or are you mad because you're disappointed?
No, I think I'm legit mad.
Okay.
Because one of the assumptions about people who are non-religious that makes me really upset is that we somehow have lesser morals than people who are religious, and that in some way we are not all, I think in very similar ways, doing our best to piece together the best morality that we can. And this assumption that the Bible in some ways like gives you easy access to morality, which I don't think it does at all. And so this idea that we are parenting with Jesus's logic, even though we don't think that we are, I feel like it's the opposite. Like, I think if you look at society, almost all functioning societies come to the golden rule because it just makes sense.
Well, I would push back on one and expand on another. I'll push back when you say the Bible doesn't offer easy morality and easy access to morality. I disagree. I think holy books are popular in part because they offer the easiest access. Look at what the words say, and there it is. Don't have to think about it as much as just follow it. But then I'll absolutely agree that with what you just said about functioning societies and the golden rule. But I'll go one step further and say that societies wouldn't exist without that being something that we were already practicing. I get this a lot talking to apologists about this very topic, that without Christianity, we wouldn't have this idea, right? This altruism wouldn't exist, where in point of fact, religion is a product of a functioning society, a group of people with shared beliefs who respond to each other's needs, who support each other, so that in part, these ideas can be perpetuated as their society grows and develops, right? But the society doesn't grow and develop without that idea existing in the first place. And so religion is a byproduct of the golden rule, not the other way around. Because the golden rule had to happen first, in a sense, because otherwise, how would we have organized to do things like religion in the first place?
I feel like I need to push back on your pushing back.
Okay.
So I think
about the Bible
Yes.
and offering easy access
Yes.
to morality. I'm not saying the Bible's morality is good. I'm just
Nope.
saying that it is easy to get a morality from a holy book because it is
don't agree.
there. Okay,
Don't
that's
agree.
fine.
Don't
That's
agree.
fine.
I think religion gives easy access to morality
Okay.
because preachers and other religious figures have taken the Bible, which is very difficult to read and understand, and says a lot of contradictory things. And they have chosen aspects of it and simplified it down to a morality that fits their desires and their community. And then they feed that simplified version that they have decided upon to their congregation. And that makes morality feel really easy. But that is not the Bible. That is the religion that has been put on top of it. And that is why I have an issue with this, because what they're doing is what everybody does. They are taking information from the Bible. They are taking information from their lives. They are taking information from the norms of the society that they grow up in. And they are doing, hopefully in good cases, I think in some cases, they are specifically not doing their best for reasons like enriching themselves and other things. But I think in best cases with religion, they are taking all of those things and doing their best to cobble together a morality that makes sense and feels right.
Right, because morality is subjective.
Yeah. And that is exactly the same thing that non-religious people do, except they don't say that one book has better answers than the rest. But it's the same thing. I think we're all doing the same thing.
Of course we are.
For the most part. And so...
No, everybody does.
Yeah.
Because what is morality except an evaluation of an action versus a goal? Like, something is evil if it, like, opposes what you're striving for as a good. It's very, like, it feels very simplistic, but I challenge you as a listener to think of a situation where you wouldn't consider something evil that isn't an opposition to what you would be able to, with thought, boil down to a goal, often a very simple goal. Like, I don't want my children to get hurt, or I don't want my community to be an unsafe place to live. And like, the thing is that a lot of apologists like to ignore, because a lot of apologetics is boils down to ignoring what we share and creating as big of an outgroup as possible so the in-group feels as special as possible. It's not actually about proselytization. It's not about conversion. It's about reassurance of the people that already believe. And that what we share comes from the fact that we are all of one species and we are social, sentient animals. And we have needs and we have desires that, by and large, we all share, regardless of what the application of that desire is. And then we ostracize, punish, or try to correct the people whose desires conflict with the well-being of the greatest number, or at least we should, because that's how society traditionally has grown. It hasn't grown despite our efforts to promote general well-being. It's grown because we do. And like, one of the earliest ways, or one of the ways that we see not necessarily anthropological, paleontological evidence of society, of morality, is when we see bone mending, or when we see old skeletons. Because when we see older and older skeletons from the same group of people, of early hominids, we know that they were caring for their old. We know now, even now with all of our medical science, how hard it can be to care for an aging loved one. So back then it would have maybe even been harder. And so when we see an older skeleton, we know that community was taking care of, and it's for altruism specifically, right? For empathy. And we knew that in looking at those skeletons, we knew from seeing bones being mended, from seeing head traumas being rehabilitated, that old wounds in old skeletons tell us that despite the inconvenience and hardship it would cause, we took care of each other. It's so simple, and the pushback is so asinine. I will never understand it. Like, we see empathy and we see organization and community in other species. We know we are animals. Saying that we're separated because some holy book says we are is just, is baseless. And so it's better just to go with the simpler solution that requires fewer assumptions.
But this made me think of something, because a few episodes ago, we ended up talking about things not necessarily that would make us believers, but that would have made us perhaps give more credence to a religious text.
Sure.
And in that discussion, we talked about sort of scientific things that could have been explained in the Bible.
Sure.
But this made me think about morality, because I think another thing that wouldn't necessarily make me a believer, but would certainly make me more curious about religion and more likely to look into it more seriously, is if people are making the claim that this book has some more profound grasp on morality than somebody could just get on their own, then I would expect some of the moral lessons to be more surprising. Like, if these were things that I needed the book for, then it feels like they should be more aha moments, because if I couldn't come to them on my own, then it should be kind of groundbreaking.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is, at least in my reading of religious text, I don't think I have had that moment, but I have had that moment reading other things.
Yeah.
And so I was curious to sort of talk about some of those. And when we were talking about this, you mentioned that you had had the same experience. So I was kind of curious what things have been moral aha moments for you. And if there are any from the Bible, that's totally cool. But, kind of what would fall into that category for you?
Well, as stated previously, I am a shameless sci-fi nerd fan. So I have 3 examples that I could think of that fit the bill. Mm-hmm. I had to think about it because I didn't necessarily qualify them in this way, but they were moments where when I am making moral considerations in my life, decisions that I do sometimes, at least for a split second, go back and reference that story as like, oh, this is like that time when this thing happened in that story. But just for the briefest moment, only because they were images, moments, and stories I loved that maybe hit me at the right time in my life. Mm-hmm. And so there are 3. One is from Dune, and it was the Litany Against Fear. For those of you who don't know, the Litany Against Fear is this really famous mantra that prayer, sort of a meditative state that you put yourself into by reciting the words that a certain group of characters has devised, and the protagonist uses and his mother uses at various points within that first book to great effect. And the idea, I'll without reciting the whole thing by heart, because that's beyond geeky, I'll just say the first sentence, which kind of says it all, which is, fear is the mind killer. And at the very end, it talks about how you will allow the fear to pass through you, and then you'll look back on it and realize that the fear was just this thing that you had control over, that it was a figment, and that by letting go of it, you're stronger for it. And so the idea of acceptance. So that was the first lesson, was like accepting that you'll be afraid of things, and knowing that you don't necessarily have to be afraid of things, that you can anticipate the fact that you will be afraid of certain things in your life. And later on, I connected it to the Stoics' idea of premeditatio malorum, like thinking ahead on disasters. Mm-hmm. So planning for the worst possible scenario, so that way you can kind of dry run, like a nightmare, like a waking nightmare. You can dry run this thing happening, and so you can sort of preform a more cogent response that's less fear-based, that's less emotional, and maybe more rational, maybe can yield a better outcome more rapidly, without having to go through that emotional processing quite as deeply or quite as long. The second, I don't want to belabor these either. The second, it comes from Asimov's Foundation and Empire. And in the second half of the book, it deals with this character called the Mule. Now, up to that point, the galaxy has been benefiting from this one character in the very first book. This is not the first book in the series, but it has been benefiting from the very first book in this series of books, which is great, and read them if you haven't, named Harry Seldon. And Harry came up with this idea of psychohistory. And even after his death, he created this holographic projection that would appear at pivotal moments in this history, this deterministic history that he predicted, to help guide humanity. And then this massively powerful, telepathic, like empath controlling emotions of entire worlds character called the Mule is born. And it's this total black swan thing where like Harry Seldon had this process that this entire galactic civilization was benefiting from, predicting events, guiding events through our foreknowledge and helping us like stave off panic and, you know, shape better responses and all that. But the Mule completely subverts that because he is the proverbial sabot in the gears, the wooden shoe that you'd throw in to break the machine. And the Mule didn't plan for this. The Mule is just being the Mule. But in that, I realized the idea of confidence and being overconfident in your assessment of what you can and should do. And going back to acceptance in the litany against fear, like accepting that things might get weird and that you just kind of have to roll with it. And that you don't necessarily have ever full control of your circumstances, and feeling that your responses are necessarily always going to be the right ones. So the Mule being like humility, because I really liked the character of Harry Seldon, and I loved that you would come back and you would see him over time. And you know, it's not a spoiler alert. Like this book is like, you know, decades older than I am now. Okay. And so like, if you haven't read it already, I'm not really ruining it, but at the same time, these books span thousands and thousands of years. And so some characters persist, perhaps like in Dune. Other characters, they die. And Harry's one of those. And I loved Harry Seldon. And so I was like, oh no, like his whole plan is for shit. But then you see that even though there's this giant hiccup, it still is okay. And the last is Snow Crash. Love Snow Crash. And in Snow Crash, you basically have an example of that parable of the two brothers that we see in like popular self-help books, these like for the last century maybe, which is you have two brothers raised in the same abusive household. One ends up being a success, saying that, oh, that abusive household motivated me and inspired me to do better. And the other dives down a bottle or it like in a needle of smack or like whatever abusive behavior, self-abusive behavior you might imagine, and blames that same upbringing, their lack of success in life. All of that is blamed on that same upbringing. And so you have same negative circumstance with two outcomes, one positive, one negative. And that's with Raven and hero protagonist. They are not blood relatives, but they have similar backstories, similar enough where they are sort of flip sides of the same coin. A great book. If you haven't read it, you should. And remember, it was written decades before Mark Zuckerberg decided to turn Facebook into Meta. Anyway, that was a very strong thing, again, about choice. And so it's really doubly interesting that I find myself following, my own version of modern stoicism, to great effect in my own life. It works for me, might not work for you, whatever, who cares? But all three of these things kind of circle back to what I find myself journaling about, swallowed that every day. And that, you're faced with a stimulus and you're not required to have a certain specific response. You have choice and you can choose to do a kind thing when somebody does you wrong. You're not required to react in kind. You're not required to get angry or be your worst self. You can choose to be your best self. And it took me a long time to realize that. So that book found me at a time when I loved that lesson, but I wasn't really able to fully implement it, I think, until much later in life. So there you go. Those are my three.
Well, it's interesting because I think my first one is a different edge of yours.
Okay, cool.
So in high school, my dad's significant other gave me a book of Camille Paglia essays to read.
I am totally unfamiliar with who Camille Paglia is, by the way. So
she is just, I feel like, a totally outside the box thinker. She wrote the book that made her famous was this sort of incredible tome called Sexual Persona, I think. And she has written about art and poetry and politics. And I will say she has taken actually, I should revise what I'm saying. I believe I should now say they have taken some very problematic views. I actually think they have said some very problematic things about trans people, but might also now identify as trans or non-binary.
Very interesting.
Which, if you are familiar with their work, is a little bit less surprising than it sounds. So I will say there is a lot I do not agree with them about. But I do appreciate that they often come at things from a perspective that I would just never think of. And in this book of essays, there was an essay about how we talk to women about rape and how there is a narrative that being raped is the worst thing that can happen to you. And it's this incredibly emotionally horrible experience. And she asks, couldn't it just feel like getting beaten up? Like, why is the fact that there's a sexual aspect to it something that makes it so psychologically difficult? And now let me say, in 99% of cases, I think it is really harder than getting beaten up. I think rape is awful, and I think it destroys people in ways that, like, we don't understand. But what I found so interesting about their perspective is it just was this asking of, do we have a right to put a narrative on somebody's personal experience of an event before we have heard from them what it means to them? And that profoundly changed the way I thought about dealing with people and situations in my life. That I do not have a right to define somebody's experience for them until they have let me know what it means to them. And I've actually spent some time working in HR, and every now and then you have to deal with people when difficult things happen. And I think really carefully about how I say things. You know, I was looking at, I had to send something out, and I was sort of looking at different ways to say something. And there was something about like, you just got to take it a day at a time. And I'm like, nope, I'm not writing that. Because I don't know how this person feels. Sometimes it can be great to take things a day at a time. Sometimes you want to like plan it all out and feel like you have a plan moving forward. I'm not saying anything that tells this person that I think I have any idea what their experience of this thing should be. All I'm going to say is that I am there for them and they can come for help if they need it. And I am so glad I had read that, because between Reader and Go, I had a miscarriage. And it ended up being kind of like a difficult medical event too, because I wouldn't stop bleeding. I had to rush to the emergency room, all this stuff. And when I got there, I mean, and obviously we had wanted another kid really bad. We had been trying for one. So we were both very sad that I had miscarried. But prior to that, we had had to do serious fertility treatments to get pregnant with Reader. And we sort of thought that some things were fixed, where we were not going to have to do fertility treatments again. And in looking at me, the doctor said something. He had like done an initial scan and he's like, oh, there might be something wrong with your fallopian tube, but we'll look at that later. And I only had one good fallopian tube. So in that moment, the only thing in the universe that mattered to me was whether this was a sign that I was going to have fertility issues again. That was my experience. And the way the doctors were dealing with it was that this miscarriage was the thing that was going to be the most emotional for me. But because I had read that essay, I remember in that moment being like, oh, they're not responding to me based on what I care about. They're responding to me based on a script that they have for this event. And that was helpful. Like, it was still really hard, but I could piece together that moment for myself in a way that I feel like I couldn't have if I hadn't read that essay.
That's really cool.
And so I actually have a couple more, but I'll keep it short and I'll just do one more because that was kind of a long example. After starting this podcast, I was talking to my mom about something, and I think astrology came up, and she sort of assumed that I had a pretty negative view on it. And I think I've said before that I love the Douglas Adams book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series. And I think it's in the second book, there's a character that one of the characters meets, and she is an astrologist. And he says, like, how can you do this if you know that none of this is real? And she says, well, all complex systems applied to a problem yield insight. And that is another thing that I feel like I have applied so many times in my life. I think it actually applies to the Bible pretty well for some folks. I think complex things like tarot readings where you have to like do interpretations and have knowledge of all the cards and how they fit together, astrology where you're like looking at the planets and all these things, the Bible where you have all of these competing ways of looking at things, two different ways that people came to be, these complex things where you're trying to incorporate a lot of information together. It's not that any of those systems are correct, but I think when intelligent, intuitive people look at those things, sometimes they kind of become ciphers for their own internal knowledge. And it is just sort of the complexity of looking at a thing in a lot of different ways can give you insight. You know, you can be in a really difficult moment in your life and reading a ton of Bible verses, and one can suddenly speak to you. And that can be beautiful. And the thing you learn from that can be like very real and meaningful to you. And it doesn't mean that the Bible had magical knowledge, but that process of reading a lot of things and just thinking, I think it's like there are certain practices that just give you room to think. And that can be really helpful. But to not over mystify that and give whatever process you were using outside importance, but just realize that it was a tool that was helpful for you in that moment. So those are my two.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I never knew either of those.
Yeah. So for our final topic, I knew our two topics were both going to be big. Mm-hmm. So I think we should split the final topic between this episode and the next.
That sounds good.
And I'm just going to make this is going to be
an amuse-bouche. It's going to be an amuse-bouche.
It is, but this is also going to be the example episode.
Oh, okay.
We just gave examples of one thing, and now we're going to give examples of another thing.
Right on.
Okay. So we might do maybe we should just do this as another series, because I have been super interested in this ongoing narrative that I've been reading about, from like the right, it's the war on men.
Series.
And from the left,
series.
I think so.
Series.
I mean,
it's a big topic. It's zeitgeisty. I think it deserves its time in the sun.
Well, I will say, so one of my favorite feminist writers is a woman named Caitlin Moran. And she just wrote several books about women. The first and like most amazing, How to Be a Woman. And she just wrote a book called What About Men, where she sort of tackles this whole, like, what's going on with men right now. And she is brilliant. So I assume she is going to have way more intelligent things to say about all of this than I will have thought of. If you are lucky enough to live in the UK, you can get that book right now. I was super pissed to learn that I can't get it until September. So given how few episodes we do, we could literally talk about this until September when I can get that book and say all the ways that we didn't think about this as intelligently as we should have. But we'll see. But so lots of people have been talking about this. I have lots of thoughts. And my mom sent me this article from, I think it was the Washington Post. And the article is called Men Are Lost. Here's a Map Out of the Wilderness. And it was by Christine Emba. And it talks about like quite a few things I want to talk about. But one of the issues she brings up is that there's sort of not a cohesive idea of what men should be like. And she talks about this teacher at a university who had a student come to him and ask, what the heck does good masculinity look like? And he tells the student, I'll be honest with you, I do not have an answer for that. And Christine Emba writes in one part, past models of masculinity feel unreachable or socially unacceptable. New ones have yet to crystallize. So I want to talk about this idea because I have serious questions about it. But that I think we should do in the next episode.
That's fine.
What I wanted to ask is, one, do you, as a man, do you have any sort of feelings about that idea? And also, in this idea of doing the example show, are there examples that you think are out there that are maybe not being seen by this piece?
Those are two interesting questions. I want to start by saying that because you inevitably are going to be viewing this through the lens of history, that any discussion that doesn't necessarily talk about how these definitions, how they change sometimes drastically over time, even within one culture, and then being drastically different between different cultures. That if you don't preface any conversation with that just acceptance of fact, that you're going to essentially just kind of go off on a tangent and think your poop don't stink. But understanding that if we're going to look at it specifically regarding what we see today, like depictions of masculinity in 2023, then I think what you need to do is start with defining what the consensus would accept as being masculine. Increasingly, that has less to do, from what I have seen in media, which is always the best way of learning truth, is through media. That was my best Seth Andrews sarcastic voice, by the way. Mm-hmm. Is that it isn't necessarily about the earning of all the money. That was what it was initially. That was what it was for decades. But now that is changing. And some people might not like it, but that doesn't mean that masculinity is inexorably tied to that anymore. I think with the advent of combat sports, there is a sense of, with the advent of combat sports and with the advent of a greater understanding of fitness and people having increasingly fewer excuses to stay physically fit. I think there is a certain amount of masculinity that is tied to physical condition and physical toughness. But there is also the whole idea of the dad bod, and that you can be masculine without that. So maybe that doesn't even track. I think masculinity is being winnowed down, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, winnowed down from these like stalwart pillars of its definitions that we used to have, just like we're doing with like the entire gender discussion at large, capital G. And so as a result of that, I am finding it hard to define like, oh, it's when a man stands up for his family. Well, a woman can stand up for hers. A man who doesn't necessarily present as masculine, that doesn't preclude them from standing up for their family. Like I don't understand like how that has to be a part of it. Okay, so maybe that isn't a part of it anymore. Man is the sole earner in the house. Well, what about masculinity requires that to be the case? Like, I think that the discussion being more nuanced now than it has been in the last couple of decades, if not ever, maybe. I don't know if any other point in history has there been this discussion about gender with this level of nuance and intensity. Maybe somebody can write in and tell me about another time historically when that has been the case, but at least not since I've been alive. Things have just been assumed. And now that those assumptions are done, I think that a lot of those archetypes kind of aren't archetypes anymore. And so do we have new archetypes? Like, I would look at somebody like Shaun T, okay? Mm-hmm. Fitness celebrity. Totally gay. Like, follow him on socials. Guy is completely proud of his sexuality, completely proud of his husband, Scott, completely proud of their two beautiful children. And it's just like, wow, they are amazing parents. He is such a great provider. He is such a great role model. Like, and he is never not masculine, you know? Mm-hmm. Even when he's like dancing around to like whatever song he's dancing around to on some TikTok, like that doesn't affect his masculinity. And maybe that's my perception of my changing perception of what masculinity can and should be, and that he fits into some part of that. I don't know. Maybe that's just my perception. But if you're asking about my perception has gotten so broad on both ends of the spectrum, masculine and feminine, that I think that it does society a disservice to say there has to be like the archetypes. And
I agree. And that's kind of what I want to talk about in the other episode.
Okay. That's the thing. I don't want to start stepping on the toes of the next episode either. So,
because when I started thinking about examples,
it's hard.
Because I think,
but that's a good thing.
Yeah. But I think there really is a range. I mean, it's interesting because the most current derivation is being played by a woman. But the first thing that came to mind for me was Doctor Who. Or the Doctor,
that's interesting.
I should say.
Yeah, sure.
Who
was a woman for a little bit.
Yeah, but that is an interesting character. And
dressed very colorfully at times.
And look, like, I think along with Douglas Adams, like, you can do some sort of, it's a British character. And I feel like in a lot of British works, there are like colonial aspects that we just can't get away from.
Sure. Or the square-jawed, James Bond sort of thing.
Yeah, But I do think that is a very interesting character who is always, I would say what defines that character is more often than not being the one to have a plan and greater insight into a situation, and also being incredibly kind and protective, even if at times the exterior is a little bit more of a kind of a prickly personality.
Yeah.
But I would say there's sort of an interesting model there in competence humor, caring, and just like never giving up that I think is a very sort of interesting model of masculinity.
But I mean, how many of those traits aren't inherently traditionally masculine? Like, there are a lot of caregiving community traits. And if you think about like, the idea of masculine, you could also think of Pa in Little House on the Prairie, right?
Yeah.
Where he was strong. He did go off and do the hard things by himself as needed. But he also, helped develop a community through his love of his family. And there's like,
and I also would say in that family was like the warm and fuzzy one.
Yeah, he wasn't afraid to emote
when it came to the kids.
And I think that for a long time there was this whole like stiff upper lip, bootstraps, don't cry, men don't cry, men do the whatever. And it's like, yeah, women do the whatever too. And women get chastised when they cry. So I guess women shouldn't cry either. We all shouldn't cry. We should all just like drink our martinis when we get home from work and like practice some light spousal abuse. I mean, like for the longest time, those depictions of masculinity were themselves, for the risk of sounding like a freaking liberal cliche, toxic. Like they didn't do anybody really a lot of good. Like, did they help to promote a corporate or work culture of competitiveness that drove a lot of innovation in America? You could argue that. You could argue that sort of like that football team mentality, it did help post-war America to a certain extent. But now you have like innovations in part being done by tech bros. And now it's like a big deal that Mark Zuckerberg has been lifting weights and does BJJ. My kids do BJJ and I lift weights, right? But like here I am on a secular parenting podcast sharing my feelings. Does that make me any less masculine, though I do the other stuff? Like there is an increasingly broad range. And I think that what it comes down to as secular parents is we set models of behavior for our kids, and whatever strengths we have, we seek to maximize. Whatever weaknesses, whatever personal psychological liabilities we have, we're open about them with our kids, and we talk and we show our kids how we're doing our best, how we're doing our damnedest to make them less liabilities moving forward. Hopefully eliminate them, but more likely just cope, just manage them effectively and let our strengths lead the way. And maybe that's what it comes down to, but that's not even specifically masculine. That's just like good parenting. So yeah, I don't know.
Well, I think it's also
such a like series, like it has to be a series. Like we could talk about this for hours.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about it in the next episode. I will also say that just when you talk about there not being a definition, I think a lot of people forget that the definition that seemed simple in the past left a lot of people out.
Yep.
Where this never felt simple.
Yep.
For many, many people who that more simplified version wasn't going to work for a lot of reasons. Mm-hmm. So.
And then Star Trek's thing about the needs of the many, right?
Yeah. I think I was also going to say like Picard, Riker, very different people, but also like.
Both masculine. Data, masculine. Geordi, masculine.
Yeah.
Total stud muffin, Geordi. Why? Because this is a guy who wasn't afraid to say, I don't know. But when he had an answer, he would stay up days on end, losing sleep, to engineer a solution, to invent, to build. But he was still fundamentally community oriented. This is a warm-hearted guy who wore his heart on his sleeve, whose best friend was a freaking android, who he brought out the human qualities of through their friendship. But at the end of the day, he worked harder than just about any other human being on that freaking ship. So I don't know, like you're talking about inclusiveness. Yeah. Like if you want to think of a masculine trait as being building a community, protecting people, but then your version of masculinity intentionally outgroups so many with nary a thought, then what good is that version of masculinity? How effective? How accurate? how internally consistent is that model of masculinity? I'd argue not at all on all counts. So I think that there's been back to the drawing board in a lot of cases, and that scares the pants off a lot of people, which is why they had to accept that the gays were here to stay. But now the whole trans thing and the non-binary thing, that allows them to be bigots all over again in a culturally effective and appropriate way within their in-groups. Jesus doesn't hate them for hating on the trans. So, here we are again. We're living out the 80s and the 90s. Yay.
Well, on that note,
back to Roy Kent.
Also, Roy Kent. Anyways.
Yes, and Ted Lasso.
Yeah, and Jamie. And how much he grows as a person.
And Jamie. And
Sam.
And Wags, who's a dad who plays trombone. Right? No, bass. I was mixing him with Riker. There you go.
Even
Gotta
cooler.
love the jazz.
I love bass.
Thankfully, I don't think that there was as much Wag's nipple as there was, Riker nipple. But Riker nipple is a thing. Look it up if you don't know what we're talking about, people.
First season, Next Generation. It's a real
episode
wild ride.
3. Episode 3.
I don't know.
We get Jonathan Frakes in a little toga thing. Yeah. Oh, that first season of Next Gen was a gift that kept on giving.
Yeah. Shocking.
Yes.
Shocking, that first season.
Yeah. You ever want to see a virally horny Patrick Stewart skipping through a doorway? I think that's episode 2.
Probably. That was the episode where I turned to you and just said, what? What are we watching?
Because we were watching that during COVID, and it was an example of, oh, wow. The Enterprise crew has, including all the medical staff, have absolutely no idea how to contain even the most basic pathogen.
Yeah. Never think of quarantine.
No, why do that when you can have sexy time between the crew? It's just, it was anyway, season 1, do yourselves a favor. Yeah. But on that note, we should wrap it up.
Yep. With lots more to talk about later. All right.
Absolutely.
So we have to thank Jonathan Zalbin and First Frame Music for the music for this podcast.
Whew, and that wraps up this episode of The Family Skeptical, where nothing is sacred except for our kids. Huzzah!
We did okay.